Margaret Hayes had been married to David for 32 years. At 58, she sometimes found it difficult to remember what her life had looked like before him. There had been a time when she had lived in a small apartment, worked long hours at a public library, and spent Saturday mornings drinking coffee alone by the window. There had been a time when she had worried about rent, wondered whether she would ever meet the right person, and imagined what her future might look like. Then David had walked into that future. He was 29 when they met, quiet and serious, with dark hair and an easy smile. Margaret had been 26. Their first date had been nothing remarkable. They had eaten dinner at a small Italian restaurant outside Columbus, Ohio, and talked until the staff began stacking chairs around them. There had been no fireworks. No dramatic declaration. Just a strange sense that talking to him felt easy. 3 years later, they were married. Over the following decades, their life became the kind of life Margaret had once dreamed about. It wasn't glamorous. It was real. There were mortgage payments, school concerts, grocery lists, broken washing machines, birthday parties, arguments about money, and Sunday dinners with the children. There were vacations that had required months of saving and anniversaries celebrated with takeout because someone was too tired to cook. They had raised 2 children. Emily, their daughter, was now 31 and lived about 40 minutes away with her husband and 2 young children. Daniel, their 28-year-old son, had moved to Chicago for work and came home whenever his schedule allowed. The house felt quieter without them. Margaret had expected that silence to make her sad. Instead, she and David had slowly learned how to live inside it. Most mornings, Margaret woke before David. She would walk downstairs, turn on the kitchen light, and start the coffee maker. Sometimes she opened the back door and stood on the small patio while the coffee brewed. Their neighborhood was peaceful. Mature trees lined the streets, and in the fall, Margaret loved watching the leaves gather along the sidewalks. She had retired from the elementary school library 2 years earlier, but she still volunteered there several mornings each week. David had worked in commercial insurance for most of his career. At 61, he was still working part-time, although he often talked about retiring completely. Their conversations had changed over the years. When they were young, they had talked about everything. Their dreams, their fears, their children, their plans. Now, they talked about appointments, groceries, the weather, the grandchildren, and what needed to be repaired around the house. Yet Margaret never considered their marriage unhappy. Love, she had learned, did not always feel like the first year of marriage. Sometimes love was simply knowing how someone took their coffee. Sometimes it was noticing that the other person had a headache before they mentioned it. Sometimes it was sitting together on the couch without saying anything at all. That was what Margaret believed she had with David. Something steady. Something safe. On a Thursday afternoon in early October, Margaret returned home from the library carrying a small paper bag of books. David wasn't home yet. She placed the books on the kitchen counter and noticed a voicemail light blinking on the answering machine. It was from their insurance company. One of the older policies needed updated paperwork. Margaret sighed. David usually handled those things. He kept nearly every important document in a tall wooden filing cabinet in his home office. The cabinet had been in their house for more than 20 years, and David knew exactly where everything was. Margaret walked upstairs. The office smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. Sunlight came through the blinds in narrow golden lines. She opened the filing cabinet and searched through folders until she realized the document she needed wasn't there. She remembered David mentioning that some older paperwork had been moved into his desk. The desk had belonged to David's father. It was an old walnut desk with brass handles and several drawers that David rarely used. Margaret opened the top drawer. Pens. Paper clips. A calculator. An old receipt. Nothing. She opened the second drawer. More paperwork. She found the document she needed almost immediately. Margaret smiled. For a moment, that was all she cared about. Then she noticed an envelope beneath the papers. It was yellowed with age. There was no name on it. No address. Just a faded crease across the middle. Margaret almost put it back. She wasn't looking for anything personal. But when she lifted the envelope, something slipped out. A photograph. It landed face up on the desk. Margaret froze. The photograph was old enough that the colors had faded. David was standing in the picture. But he wasn't the David she knew. He looked perhaps 28 or 29 years old. His hair was darker. His face was thinner. He was wearing a brown jacket and standing outside what looked like an older brick house. And beside him stood a woman. Margaret stared at her. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s. She had shoulder-length brown hair, a narrow face, and a serious expression. Margaret didn't recognize her. At least, that was what she thought at first. She picked up the photograph. There was something strangely familiar about the woman's face. Margaret looked closer. Her stomach tightened. She knew that face. Not personally. Not exactly. But she had seen it somewhere. A long time ago. She searched her memory. A family gathering. A newspaper clipping. An old photograph. Nothing came. Margaret turned the photograph over. Nothing was written on the back. She studied David again. There was something about his expression that bothered her. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the woman. Not affectionately. Not romantically. Almost as though he was worried about her. Margaret frowned. Then she heard the garage door opening downstairs. David was home. She quickly placed the photograph back inside the envelope. For a few seconds, she stood there with her hand resting on the desk. She didn't know why her heart was beating faster. It was only an old photograph. David had been a young man before they met. He had lived an entire life before Margaret became part of it. There was nothing strange about that. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph mattered. She returned the envelope to the drawer and closed it. When David walked into the kitchen several minutes later, Margaret was preparing dinner. He kissed her cheek. "How was the library?" "Busy," she said. He opened the refrigerator. "Anything interesting happen?" Margaret watched him for a moment. She almost asked, "Who was the woman?" Instead, she said, "Not really." David nodded and reached for a bottle of water. The moment passed. Or at least Margaret thought it had. That evening, they ate dinner together and watched television. Everything looked exactly as it had the night before. The same couch. The same coffee table. The same framed wedding photograph on the wall. Margaret glanced at it. She and David had been so young. She remembered that day clearly. David's nervous smile. Her father's speech. Emily dancing at the reception years later when she was only 4. 32 years of memories stood between Margaret and the woman in that old photograph. She told herself there was nothing to worry about. But later that night, after David had gone upstairs, Margaret found herself standing in the hallway. She looked toward the office. She thought about the photograph. Then she remembered where she had seen that woman's face before. It came to her suddenly. A photograph from years ago. One that had been tucked inside an old family album. Margaret's heart sank. Because if her memory was right, the woman in David's photograph wasn't a stranger at all. And the next morning, she intended to find out why. Part 2, The First Sign. Margaret barely slept that night. She had spent hours lying beside David, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing while the question kept returning to her mind. Where had she seen that woman before? It wasn't the kind of question that normally kept Margaret awake. After 32 years of marriage, she knew that memories could be unreliable. Faces blurred. Names disappeared. Events that once seemed important became difficult to place. But this felt different. The woman's face had stirred something in Margaret before she even understood why. Just after 6 the next morning, Margaret slipped out of bed. She moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake David. Downstairs, she made coffee and stood by the kitchen window. Outside, the morning was gray and cool. Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug. She told herself that the simplest explanation was probably the correct one. David had known many people before their marriage. There was no reason a photograph from his younger years should mean anything. Still, she couldn't forget the way he had looked in it. He hadn't looked happy. He had looked concerned. Margaret remembered that expression because she had seen it before. Usually when someone in the family was in trouble. At 7, David came downstairs. His hair was still damp from the shower. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He kissed her forehead and reached for the coffee. Margaret watched him carefully. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then she said, Margaret's voice sounded calmer than she felt. "She was only going through some paperwork. There was a photograph in your desk." David stopped. Only for a second. But Margaret noticed. He looked at her. "What photograph?" "The old one." His expression changed. Not dramatically. There was no sudden anger or panic. Just a brief tightening around his eyes. "What old photograph?" "The one with you and a woman." David looked down at his coffee. Margaret waited. He took a sip. "That? Yes. It was from a long time ago. I figured." David put the mug down. "She was someone from before." "Before?" Margaret noticed the word immediately. "Before what?" He looked at her. "Before us." Margaret nodded slowly. "That doesn't tell her much." David gave a small shrug. "She was a friend." "A friend?" "Yes." Margaret studied his face. There was nothing obviously suspicious about his answer. But something was missing. A name. She waited for him to provide one. He didn't. "What's her name?" David's jaw tightened slightly. "Linda." Margaret's heart skipped. Linda. The name felt familiar. She searched her memory. Linda what? Linda Parker. The room suddenly seemed very quiet. Margaret lowered her eyes. She knew that name. She didn't know where. But she knew it. Did she live here? Years ago. Are you still in contact with her? No. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Margaret looked up. David had already picked up his coffee. "I haven't seen her in years," he said. Margaret didn't respond. She wanted to ask more. Why was the photograph hidden? Why had he never mentioned Linda? Why did he look so uncomfortable? But after 32 years, Margaret knew that pressing someone too early could make them defensive. So she nodded. "Okay." David gave her a small smile. "It's just an old picture." Margaret smiled back. "Right." But the moment David left for work, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen. The word Linda remained in her mind. She walked upstairs. She opened the family photo albums. There were several. Birthdays. Christmases. Vacations. School graduations. Wedding anniversaries. Margaret turned page after page. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for. Then she found it. An old family photograph from nearly 25 years earlier. It had been taken at David's parents' house. Margaret remembered the day. It had been Daniel's first Christmas. The whole family had gathered. David's parents. His brother Thomas. Margaret. David. The children. And several family friends. Margaret stared at the photograph. Then her eyes moved toward the far left. There she was. A younger woman standing near David's mother. Linda. Margaret's fingers tightened around the album. She remembered Linda being there. She remembered someone introducing her. But the memory was strangely incomplete. Margaret closed her eyes. She tried to remember the conversation. Nothing. Only fragments. A woman standing beside the Christmas tree. David's mother saying something. David walking across the room. Linda leaving early. Margaret opened her eyes. Why hadn't she remembered her before? She looked at the photograph again. Linda had been standing only a few feet away from David. Margaret had apparently seen her decades ago. So why had David described her as someone from before their marriage? Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. Maybe he had meant before their marriage and then again years later. Maybe Linda was simply an old family acquaintance. That explanation was possible. But another detail bothered her. The photograph in David's desk had been carefully hidden. Not stored with family photographs. Not placed in an album. Hidden beneath paperwork inside a locked office. Margaret closed the album. She decided not to search further. At least not yet. That afternoon, Emily stopped by with the children. The house filled with noise. The grandchildren ran through the living room while Margaret prepared sandwiches in the kitchen. For several hours, the photograph disappeared from her thoughts. That was what family had always done for her. It reminded her of what mattered. After Emily left, Margaret cleaned the kitchen. David came home around 6. He seemed normal. He asked about the grandchildren. He complained about traffic. He told Margaret about a client who had forgotten an appointment. Everything sounded ordinary. Too ordinary. That evening, after dinner, Margaret noticed something. David went upstairs. 10 minutes later, he came back down. He walked directly toward the office. Margaret was sitting in the living room. She watched him disappear through the doorway. A few moments later, he returned. His expression was neutral. He sat down beside her. "What are you watching?" "Nothing important." He picked up the remote. Margaret looked at him. "You went into the office?" "Yeah." "What for?" David hesitated. "I needed something." Margaret didn't ask what. She already knew. Later that night, David went to bed before her. Margaret remained downstairs. She wasn't trying to spy on him. At least, that was what she told herself. She simply wanted to understand why an old photograph had suddenly become so important. When she finally went upstairs, she passed the office. The door was slightly open. She stopped. The desk drawer was closed. But she remembered exactly where the envelope had been. Margaret stood there for several seconds. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. David was standing at the end of the hallway. Neither spoke. His eyes moved from Margaret to the office door. Then back to her. "What are you doing?" Margaret swallowed. "Nothing." David looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked past her and entered the office. He opened the drawer. Margaret watched from the hallway. He reached inside, checked something, then closed it again. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Margaret suddenly understood one thing. David was making sure the photograph was still there. She went to bed that night with a heavy feeling in her chest. For the first time in 32 years, Margaret wondered whether there was a part of her husband's life that he had deliberately kept separate from hers. And she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. But the next morning, Margaret would find something in the drawer that would make it impossible to look away. Margaret woke before sunrise. For several minutes, she remained still beneath the covers, staring at the ceiling. David was asleep beside her. His face looked peaceful, almost younger. There was something unsettling about seeing him that way after the previous evening. For 32 years, Margaret had known the small details of his sleeping face. The slight crease between his eyebrows. The way he turned toward the window when he was tired. The soft sound he made when he breathed deeply. She had never looked at him and wondered who he might have been before her. Until now. Margaret quietly got out of bed. She dressed in the bathroom, went downstairs, and made coffee. She didn't touch David's office immediately. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with her mug and watched the first light appear through the windows. She tried to reason with herself. The photograph could have meant anything. Linda could have been an old friend. The envelope could contain nothing more than memories David had forgotten. There were 100 innocent explanations. But there was one fact Margaret couldn't dismiss. David had gone into the office specifically to check that the photograph was still there. That meant the photograph mattered to him. And if it mattered enough to hide, Margaret had a right to wonder why. At 8:30, David left for work. Margaret watched his car disappear down the street. She waited another 10 minutes before going upstairs. The office door was closed. She opened it. Sunlight fell across the walnut desk. Margaret stood there for a moment. Then she pulled open the drawer. The envelope was exactly where David had left it. Her hands felt strangely cold. She removed the photograph. The woman stared back at her. Linda Parker. Margaret looked at David. Young. Serious. Almost worried. She turned the photograph over again. Nothing. Then she noticed that the envelope was thicker than it had seemed the day before. She ran her fingers along the inside edge. Something was tucked behind the photograph. Margaret pulled gently. A second photograph slid out. Her breath caught. It showed Linda again. But this time, she wasn't standing beside David. She was standing outside a small house with a little girl. The child couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. Linda had one hand resting on the girl's shoulder. The girl was smiling. Margaret stared at her. There was something familiar about the child. She looked at the photograph for nearly a minute before the memory came. A Christmas. A family gathering. A little girl standing near the staircase. Margaret remembered seeing her. She remembered asking David who she was. And she remembered his answer. A family friend's daughter. Margaret's stomach tightened. She turned the photograph over. This time, there was writing. The handwriting was faded. Linda and Sarah, December 1990. Margaret sat down. Sarah. The name meant something. She searched her memory. Then another image surfaced. David's parents' old house. A Christmas tree. A young girl in a red sweater. Margaret had seen her before. She had been there during Daniel's first Christmas. Margaret's heart began beating faster. Why would David have a photograph of Linda and Sarah? Why had it been hidden? And why did David never mention Sarah? Margaret looked at the photograph again. The little girl had Linda's eyes. There was no obvious connection to David. But Margaret could not stop thinking about the years before their marriage. She placed the photographs on the desk. Then she searched the envelope again. This time, she found a folded piece of paper. It was not a letter. It was an old address. A street name. A house number. And beneath it, a handwritten phone number that had long since been crossed out. Margaret stared at the address. She recognized the street. It was on the other side of Columbus. She had driven past it years ago. Maybe hundreds of times. She picked up her phone. Her first instinct was to search the address. She stopped. If David had gone to such lengths to keep this hidden, she didn't know what she might discover. She put the phone down. Then picked it up again. She searched the street. Several results appeared. Most were irrelevant. Then she found an old property record. The address belonged to a house that had once been owned by a woman named Linda Parker. Margaret's hands began to tremble. She continued searching. A second result appeared. A local newspaper archive. The article was from more than 30 years ago. Margaret opened it. She read slowly. Linda Parker had lived in that neighborhood with her young daughter, Sarah. The article mentioned a difficult period in the family's life. It didn't explain much. But one sentence caught Margaret's attention. The family received assistance from a local businessman during the transition. Margaret stared at the screen. The businessman wasn't named. But she knew what she was thinking. She didn't want to think it. Not yet. She closed the browser. For several minutes, she sat completely still. Then she remembered something else. David had once mentioned helping a family friend during a difficult financial period. He had never said who. Margaret had never asked. At the time, she had trusted him. She still wanted to trust him. But trust was becoming harder when pieces of the past kept appearing in places where they shouldn't have been. She folded the paper and put everything back. Then she noticed one final detail. The photograph of Linda and Sarah had a date. December 1990. Margaret did the math. She and David had been married in June 1994. Sarah would have been about 9 years old when Margaret first met David. Margaret remembered the years before their marriage. David had told her that he had spent most of that period working and helping his parents. He had never mentioned Linda. He had never mentioned Sarah. Margaret put a hand over her mouth. A quiet fear began to form. Maybe this wasn't about an old girlfriend. Maybe there was a child involved. The thought was painful enough that Margaret immediately rejected it. David couldn't have had a secret child. Not without her knowing. Not after 32 years. She knew his family. She had met his parents. She had known his brother. She had attended family weddings and funerals. She had spent holidays with people who had known David his entire life. How could something this large have remained hidden? Margaret forced herself to breathe. There had to be another explanation. She placed the photographs back inside the envelope. Then she noticed a small crease along the inside flap. She opened it carefully. Another piece of paper was tucked beneath the lining. Margaret pulled it free. It was an old receipt. A handwritten date appeared at the top. June 14, 1994. Margaret froze. That was the week before her wedding. She looked at the receipt. The business name was unfamiliar. But the address wasn't. It was near Linda Parker's old neighborhood. Margaret's fingers tightened around the paper. June 14th. Her wedding was June 21st. 1 week. Just 7 days before she married David. She sat in the quiet office, surrounded by 32 years of memories. The house was silent. For the first time, Margaret understood that whatever had happened between David and Linda had not simply belonged to some distant chapter of his life. It had reached into the very beginning of their marriage. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether David had known Linda. Margaret already knew the answer. The question was what he had been doing there 7 days before he married her. She placed the receipt beside the photographs. Then she heard the sound of a car approaching the house. Margaret's heart jumped. David. He wasn't supposed to be home for another 3 hours. She quickly gathered the papers. But before she could return them to the envelope, she noticed something written faintly across the bottom of the receipt. A name. Sarah Parker. Margaret stared at it. And this time, she knew she could no longer pretend the mystery had nothing to do with her family. Margaret heard the car pull into the driveway and quickly slipped the papers back into the envelope. Her hands were shaking. She placed the envelope exactly where she had found it, closed the drawer, and stepped away from the desk. By the time David entered the house, Margaret was downstairs. She stood at the kitchen counter, washing a coffee mug that was already clean. David walked in carrying his briefcase. "You're home early," Margaret said. "The client canceled." He set the briefcase down. "You okay?" Margaret looked at him. For one dangerous second, she considered asking about June 14, 1994. She wanted to hear his explanation before she invented one of her own. But the words wouldn't come. "Just tired," she said. David nodded. He walked toward the refrigerator. Margaret watched him from the corner of her eye. He seemed completely ordinary. That almost hurt more. How could the man standing in front of her be carrying a secret large enough to make her question 32 years of marriage? That afternoon, Margaret found herself thinking about the beginning of their relationship. Not because she wanted to remember. Because she needed to know what she might have missed. She remembered meeting David in the spring of 1991. She had been 26. David had been 29. They had met at a small community fundraiser organized by the library where Margaret worked. David had come with a friend. Margaret remembered noticing him because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He stood near the back of the room, holding a paper cup of coffee and listening while everyone else talked. Later, he had approached the book table where Margaret was helping organize donated novels. He picked up a mystery novel. "Any good?" Margaret had looked at him. "Very." "Then why is it in the donation pile?" "Because someone else deserves to enjoy it." David smiled. That had been the beginning. Their first date came 2 weeks later. He took her to a little Italian restaurant where the tablecloths were white and the portions were too large. They talked for nearly 3 hours. Margaret remembered being surprised by how much David spoke about his family. He talked about his parents, his older brother, Thomas, the difficult relationship between the two brothers, his father's health, his plans to eventually buy a house. But he never mentioned Linda. He never mentioned Sarah. At the time, Margaret had not thought anything of it. People didn't tell each other everything on a first date. Over the next 2 years, their relationship became serious. Margaret remembered David being attentive. He called when he said he would. He showed up when she needed him. When Margaret's mother underwent surgery, David spent hours in the hospital waiting room with her. When Margaret worried about money, he helped her create a budget. When she doubted whether they were ready for marriage, he told her they didn't have to rush. He had seemed dependable. That was the word Margaret had always used for him. Dependable. In 1993, David proposed. There had been no elaborate restaurant reservation, no crowd, no dramatic speech. He had taken Margaret to a small park where they used to walk on Sunday mornings. They sat on a bench beneath an oak tree. David reached into his coat pocket. "Margaret," he had said, "there are a lot of things in life that neither of us can control." She remembered laughing because she thought he was nervous. Then he continued, "But whatever happens," he wanted to build a life with her. Margaret had said yes. They married the following June. June 21, 1994. Margaret remembered that week vividly. She remembered flowers arriving at the house. Her mother calling every morning. Emily was still years away. There had been family dinners and last-minute arrangements. But there was one strange thing about that week. David had disappeared for an afternoon. Margaret remembered it now. She had asked where he was going. He had said there was a family matter he needed to handle. At the time, she hadn't questioned him. Why would she? They were about to be married. She trusted him. She trusted that whatever needed handling was exactly what he said it was. Now she remembered something else. David had returned that evening looking exhausted. Margaret had asked whether everything was okay. He had smiled and told her everything would be fine. She had believed him. For 32 years, she had never thought about that afternoon again. Until now. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug. The memory felt different. Not because she knew what had happened. Because she now knew that June 14 had appeared on a receipt connected to Linda Parker. 7 days before their wedding. She closed her eyes. A painful thought entered her mind. Had David been saying goodbye to someone? Had he been helping Linda? Had Sarah been involved? Or had something happened that he believed Margaret could never know? Margaret didn't have the answers. But the past was beginning to feel less distant. That evening, David suggested they look through some old photographs. It was an innocent suggestion. Their daughter had sent pictures of the grandchildren, and David wanted to find an older photograph for a family project. They sat together on the living room floor with several albums. Margaret felt a strange tension in her chest. David turned the pages. There were photographs of their wedding, their first apartment, their honeymoon, Emily as a baby, Daniel learning to ride a bicycle, Christmas mornings, family vacations. For a while, Margaret forgot about the hidden envelope. Then David turned to a photograph from 1995. He and Margaret were standing beside a Christmas tree. Margaret was pregnant with Emily. David was smiling. She looked at the picture for a long moment. "Do you remember that Christmas?" she asked. Of course. You were working a lot. David smiled. We needed the money. Margaret nodded. Then she noticed something in the background. A framed photograph sat on a shelf. It showed David's parents. And beside them was another family photograph. Margaret leaned closer. David turned the page. What's wrong? Nothing. She closed the album. She didn't want him to see the fear in her expression. Later that night, after David went to bed, Margaret called Susan. Susan had been her closest friend for more than 25 years. She listened without interrupting as Margaret described the photograph. When Margaret finished, there was silence on the other end. Do you think he cheated? Susan finally asked. I don't know. Do you think he had a child? Margaret swallowed. I don't know that either. Susan's voice softened. Then don't decide what happened before you know. Margaret stared through the window into the dark backyard. I keep thinking about the beginning of our marriage. Why? Because if something happened then, it means he carried it through all these years. Susan didn't answer immediately. Then she said, maybe he was protecting someone. Margaret closed her eyes. That possibility frightened her almost as much as the possibility of betrayal. Because if David had been protecting someone, then someone had needed protection. And if someone had needed protection, something serious must have happened. The next morning, Margaret went back to the family albums. She searched through photographs from the early years of her marriage. There were hundreds. Then she found one that made her stop. It had been taken at David's parents' house in December 1995. Margaret, David, Thomas, and several relatives stood around the Christmas tree. Near the edge of the photograph was a young girl. Sarah. Margaret knew it immediately. The girl from Linda's photograph was standing in the background of her own family photograph. She had seen her before. Not once. Several times. And yet David had never explained who she was. Margaret slowly lowered the album. She had spent 32 years believing that the most important parts of her marriage had happened in front of her. Now she was beginning to wonder how many things had happened just outside the frame. She turned the page again. A small card fell from between the photographs. It was an anniversary card. The date was faded. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret had seen it before. It was the same handwriting found on the old receipt. And beneath the faded message was a name. Linda. Margaret stared at it. Her heart sank. Whatever David had been hiding, it had been there from the beginning. And Margaret was finally close enough to see it. Margaret kept the card in her hand for several minutes. The house was quiet. David had already left for work. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street, and a delivery truck rolled slowly past the house. Everything around her looked ordinary. But Margaret no longer felt as though she were living inside an ordinary life. She looked at the faded handwriting again. Linda. There was no last name. No explanation. Just the name. And somehow, that single word felt heavier than the photograph. Margaret returned the card to the album and closed it. She didn't want to become the kind of wife who searched through her husband's belongings. She had never imagined herself doing this. For 32 years, she had believed that trust meant not looking for reasons to doubt someone. But now she wondered whether trust also meant knowing when something was wrong. She carried the photograph, the receipt, and the card downstairs. Then she placed them on the kitchen table. She studied them together. The photograph of David and Linda. The photograph of Linda and Sarah. The receipt dated June 14, 1994. The anniversary card. 4 small pieces of paper. 4 fragments from a life Margaret had apparently never known. She reached for her phone. This time, she searched for Linda Parker. The first results were useless. There were several women with the same name. Margaret narrowed the search to Ohio. Then Columbus. Then the neighborhood from the old address. Nothing. She almost gave up. Then she found an old community newsletter preserved online by a local historical society. There was a photograph from a neighborhood event. Margaret recognized Linda immediately. She looked older now. Her hair was shorter. There were more lines around her eyes. But it was unmistakably the same woman. Beneath the photograph was a caption. Linda Parker, longtime resident and volunteer. Margaret stared at the screen. The article was only 5 years old. Linda was still alive. And she still lived in the same area. Margaret leaned back. For the first time, the mystery felt close enough to touch. She searched again. This time she found an address. Margaret wrote it down. Then she sat there for nearly 10 minutes without moving. She could go there. She could knock on the door. She could ask one question. Who was David Hayes to Linda Parker? But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, Margaret opened another browser window and searched for Sarah Parker. The name produced fewer results. Then she found an old newspaper archive. The article was dated 1994. Margaret opened it. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. Sarah Parker had been mentioned as a child in a brief community article about a local family facing financial hardship. The article described Linda as a single mother. Margaret's stomach tightened. She read the rest. There was no mention of Sarah's father. But there was one sentence that made Margaret stop. A local businessman had quietly assisted the family with housing expenses during a difficult transition. Margaret read the sentence twice. Local businessman. She immediately thought of David. Not because he had been wealthy. He hadn't. But during the early years of their marriage, David had worked for his father's insurance business. He had often told Margaret that he had helped people who were struggling. Margaret had always admired that about him. Could this have been one of those cases? She wanted it to be. The alternative was harder to consider. She searched for more articles. There were references to Linda's family. A house sale. A school event. A community fundraiser. But no explanation of David's connection. Margaret finally found something that made her heart stop. An archived business directory listed the address of the insurance office where David had worked in 1994. It was only a few miles from Linda's old home. That proved nothing. But it added another piece. Margaret closed the computer. She needed air. She put on her coat and walked around the neighborhood. The October wind had picked up. Leaves scattered across the sidewalk. Margaret passed the park where she and David had once walked before their wedding. She stopped beside the old oak tree. The bench was still there. She sat down. For years, that bench had represented the beginning of her marriage. Now it reminded her of a question she couldn't answer. Had David been completely honest with her when he proposed? Or had he been carrying a secret even then? Margaret remembered his face that day. The nervous smile. The way he had held her hand. The words about building a life together. She had believed every word. Maybe he had believed them too. That possibility gave her a strange ache. Perhaps secrets weren't always born from a lack of love. Perhaps sometimes they were born from fear. But fear did not make them harmless. Margaret returned home before noon. David called during lunch. "Everything okay?" "Yes. What are you doing?" "Just getting some things organized." There was a pause. Then David asked, "You haven't been going through the old office again, have you?" Margaret froze. Her grip tightened around the phone. "How did you know?" Another pause. "I just wondered." Margaret stared at the wall. "You seem worried about that drawer." "I told you. It's old stuff." "What kind of old stuff?" David sighed. "Margaret, please. Please." That word unsettled her. Not because it was angry. Because it sounded tired. Almost afraid. Margaret lowered her voice. "Who is Sarah?" Silence. Long silence. Margaret could hear traffic in the background. Then David said, "Where did you hear that name?" Her heart sank. He hadn't asked who Sarah was. He had asked where she heard the name. That was an answer by itself. Margaret closed her eyes. "Who is she?" "David, I can't talk about this right now." "Why?" "Because I'm at work." "Then talk about it tonight." Another silence. "I will." The call ended. Margaret stood in the kitchen staring at the phone. He had promised to talk. But something inside her told her that David would say as little as possible. That evening, David came home later than usual. He seemed exhausted. Margaret didn't mention the conversation. They ate dinner quietly. Afterward, David went upstairs. Margaret remained at the table. She waited. Eventually, David came downstairs. He sat across from her. "I should have told you something a long time ago." Margaret's heart began to pound. "What?" David looked down at his hands. "Linda was going through a difficult time when I knew her." Margaret said nothing. "I helped her." "How?" "Financially." Margaret's expression tightened. "Why?" David looked away. "She needed help." "Because of Sarah?" David didn't answer. Margaret felt a chill move through her. "You knew her daughter?" "Yes." "How well?" David rubbed his forehead. "Margaret, it was a long time ago." "That doesn't answer the question." "I knew Sarah." Margaret swallowed. "Was she your daughter?" David looked up sharply. "No." The answer came immediately. Margaret watched his face. He looked genuinely shaken. "No," he repeated. "Sarah was never my daughter." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and confusion. "Then why did you hide her?" David stood. "I wasn't hiding her. You kept her photograph in your desk." "I kept a lot of things." "Why that one?" He didn't answer. Margaret stood too. "David, what happened?" He looked toward the hallway. "I need some time." Margaret felt anger rising. "You've had 32 years." David flinched. The words seemed to hurt him. For a moment, neither moved. Then David quietly said, "There are things about my family you don't know." Margaret's heart sank. "What things?" He shook his head. "I can't explain it tonight." He walked upstairs. Margaret remained alone. She looked at the photographs on the table. She finally understood that David's secret wasn't simply about Linda. It was about his family. And whatever had happened before Margaret entered his life had been serious enough for him to carry it silently for more than 3 decades. The next morning, Margaret made a decision. She would stop asking David to tell her the truth. If he couldn't tell her, she would find it herself. She picked up the address she had written down. Linda Parker. For the first time, Margaret wondered what would happen if she knocked on Linda's door. And whether Linda had been waiting all these years for someone to finally ask the question David never wanted answered. Margaret carried Linda Parker's address in her purse for 3 days. She didn't tell David. She didn't tell Emily. She didn't even tell Susan exactly when she planned to go. Every morning, Margaret would see the folded piece of paper inside her purse and feel the same knot forming in her stomach. She had spent 32 years believing that difficult questions were better answered when people were ready to speak. But David had been given 3 decades. He had chosen silence. Now Margaret was beginning to understand that waiting for him to become comfortable with the truth might mean waiting forever. On Saturday morning, David left the house around 9. He told Margaret he was meeting an old colleague for coffee. She watched him back out of the driveway. Then she waited. 10 minutes. 20. Finally, she picked up her purse. The address was less than 30 minutes away. Margaret drove slowly. She passed familiar streets, shopping centers, churches, and small neighborhoods she had known for years without ever realizing how closely they were connected to David's past. The closer she came to Linda's neighborhood, the more nervous she became. She nearly turned around twice. What if Linda refused to speak? What if she told Margaret something she wasn't prepared to hear? What if the photograph had nothing to do with what Margaret feared? That last thought gave her pause. Maybe she was making a terrible mistake. Maybe Linda had simply been someone David had helped years ago. Maybe Sarah had been the daughter of a friend. Maybe the hidden photographs were painful memories David had never known how to explain. But then Margaret remembered the way David had reacted when she mentioned Sarah. He hadn't looked confused. He had looked afraid. That was enough. Margaret continued driving. Linda's house was a modest one-story brick home on a quiet street. There were 2 flower beds near the front door and a small wooden bench beneath a window. Margaret parked across the street. She sat inside her car for almost 5 minutes. Then she stepped outside. The October air was cold against her face. She walked toward the house. With each step, her heart beat faster. She reached the front door. Her hand hovered over the bell. Then she pressed it. Nothing happened. Margaret waited. She pressed it again. Footsteps sounded inside. The door opened. A woman in her late 50s stood there. Margaret recognized her immediately. Linda. She looked older than she had in the photograph, of course. Her hair was shorter now, streaked heavily with gray. But her eyes were the same. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Linda's expression changed. First confusion. Then recognition. Margaret wasn't sure whether Linda recognized her from the old family gatherings or simply understood why she had come. "Margaret Hayes?" Linda asked quietly. Margaret felt a chill move through her. "You know who she is?" Linda looked down. "Yes." The answer was almost a whisper. Margaret swallowed. "Then she knows why I'm here." Linda stepped back. "Please come in." The living room was simple and warm. A lamp beside the sofa cast a soft yellow glow across the room. There were family photographs on the walls. Margaret saw a younger Sarah in several of them. She stopped near one. Sarah appeared to be about 10 years old. Margaret remembered that face. She had seen that child before. At Christmas. At family gatherings. At David's parents' house. A question rose in her throat. But Linda spoke first. She was a good child. Margaret turned. "Sarah?" Linda nodded. "She still is." Margaret sat down. Linda remained standing for a moment before taking the chair opposite her. Neither woman knew where to begin. Finally, Margaret said, "She was around David's family when I was young." Linda looked at her. "Yes." "Why?" Linda took a slow breath. "That isn't an easy story." Margaret almost laughed. "Nothing about this has been easy." Linda's eyes lowered. "You found the photograph?" Margaret nodded. "The one of David and you?" Linda looked toward the wall. "He kept it?" "Yes." "Why?" Linda hesitated. "Because it reminded him of a time when he thought he could fix something that couldn't be fixed." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "What does that mean?" Linda didn't answer. Instead, she asked, "What did David tell her?" Margaret stared at her. "He said he helped Linda financially." "That sounds like him." "Who was Sarah's father?" Linda's face changed. Pain moved across it. Margaret immediately knew she had asked the right question. Linda looked toward the floor. Sarah's father was someone David knew very well. Margaret waited. "Was he David's friend?" Linda shook her head. "No." "His brother?" Linda looked up. Their eyes met. Margaret felt the room become completely still. But Linda didn't say the name. "Not yet." Margaret whispered, "Thomas?" Linda's silence was enough. Margaret leaned back. "David's older brother. Thomas." She had known him for years. He had attended their wedding. He had held Emily when she was a baby. He had come to their house for Thanksgiving. He had always been polite to Margaret, although she had never felt especially close to him. Thomas had died 6 years earlier. Margaret remembered David standing beside his brother's hospital bed. She remembered how devastated he had been. She had assumed it was simply grief. Now she wondered what else had been hidden inside that grief. Thomas was Sarah's father? Linda nodded slowly. Margaret struggled to understand. But why would David keep all of this secret? Linda's expression hardened. Because David promised Thomas. Promised him what? That he would protect the family. Margaret stared at her. Protect them from what? Linda looked toward the window. I think David believed he could carry the burden alone. Margaret felt anger rising again. He had a wife. Linda closed her eyes briefly. I know. He had children. I know. He had 32 years to tell her. I know. The quiet agreement somehow made Margaret angrier. She stood. Then why didn't he? Linda looked at her. Because the truth wasn't only about Thomas. Margaret stopped. What does that mean? Linda hesitated. There are things David never told you because he thought they would destroy your family. Margaret's voice became quieter. What happened? Linda looked at her for a long time. Then she said, there was an accident. Margaret felt the words settle heavily between them. What kind of accident? Linda shook her head. I don't think I should be the one to tell you. Margaret's frustration broke through. Then who should? David. He won't. Linda looked away. That is why he kept the photograph. Margaret didn't understand. Linda continued. He wanted to remember what happened without ever having to explain it. Margaret thought about the photograph again. David standing beside Linda. The worried expression. The old house. The child. The date. June 14, 1994. 1 week before Margaret's wedding. She looked at Linda. Was the photograph taken before my wedding? Yes. Why was David there? Linda's eyes filled with sadness. Because something had happened. What? Linda shook her head. I can't. Margaret closed her eyes. For years, she had believed that asking for the truth was an act of loyalty. Now she realized that the truth could also be a burden. Still, she couldn't go home and pretend nothing had happened. She stood. Thank you for talking to her. Linda rose too. Before Margaret reached the door, Linda spoke. Margaret. She turned. Linda's voice was gentle. David isn't the man you think he is. Margaret's heart sank. Linda continued. But he isn't the man you are afraid he is, either. Margaret stared at her. What does that mean? You'll understand when he tells you everything. Margaret left without another question. Outside, she stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply. She expected to feel relieved. Instead, she felt more confused than ever. The photograph was an evidence of an affair. Sarah wasn't David's daughter. Linda wasn't his former lover. But something terrible had happened. Something involving Thomas. Something that had occurred before Margaret's wedding. And David had spent 32 years carrying it alone. On the drive home, Margaret's phone rang. It was Emily. Mom? Hi, sweetheart. Is everything okay? Margaret tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Why? Dad called me. Margaret's heart skipped. What did he say? He asked whether you've been asking questions about his family. Margaret said nothing. Emily continued. He sounded scared. Margaret looked through the windshield. For the first time, she understood that David's secret wasn't simply threatening her marriage. It was beginning to reach their children. She pulled into the driveway. David's car was already there. He was waiting for her. Margaret stepped out. David stood near the front door. His face looked exhausted. He didn't ask where she had been. He already knew. You went to see Linda, he said. Margaret looked at him. Yes. David closed his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he whispered, Margaret, there is something you need to know. She waited. He looked older than he had that morning. Not 61. Much older. I should have told you years ago. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. Then tell her now. David nodded. But before he could speak, he looked toward the house. Toward the family photographs on the wall. Toward the life they had built together. And Margaret saw something in his expression that frightened her more than anger ever could. Regret. Deep, unbearable regret. David finally said, it started with Thomas. Margaret held her breath. But David didn't continue. Not yet. And Margaret realized that whatever had happened 32 years ago was finally coming back to the surface. This time, she wasn't going to let him bury it again. David remained standing near the front door. Margaret had never seen him look like that. His shoulders were lowered, his face pale, and his eyes fixed somewhere beyond her, as though he were trying to find the courage to speak. For 32 years, Margaret had known David's expressions. She knew when he was tired. She knew when he was frustrated. She knew when something at work had gone wrong. She knew when he was worried about their children. But this was different. This was fear. Margaret closed the car door behind her. "Tell her." David nodded. He stepped aside. They walked into the house together. Neither spoke until they reached the living room. Margaret remained standing. David sat on the edge of the sofa. For a moment, he looked at the family photographs arranged across the shelves. Their wedding picture, Emily's graduation, Daniel's first birthday, a photograph of the four of them on a beach. 32 years of memories. Then David lowered his head. "Thomas was my older brother," he said. Margaret nodded. "She knows." David looked up. "No. She doesn't know everything." Margaret's heart tightened. "What happened?" David rubbed his hands together. Thomas had always been reckless. Margaret remembered that. Thomas had been charming, outgoing, and unpredictable. He had made decisions quickly and regretted them later. David had been the opposite. Careful, responsible, quiet. The two brothers had often been described as completely different. David continued. In 1993, Thomas met Linda. Margaret sat across from him. They became involved? Yes. For how long? About a year. Margaret waited. And Sarah? David nodded. She was Thomas's daughter. Margaret felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. At least that part was finally clear. Why didn't anyone tell her? Because Thomas didn't want to admit it. Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" "He was afraid." "Of what?" "Everything." David looked toward the window. He was afraid his career would be ruined. He was afraid his parents would find out. He was afraid Linda would expect him to marry her. Margaret stared at him. "So he walked away?" David's expression tightened. He tried. "What happened?" "Linda refused to let him disappear completely." Margaret understood. She wanted him to take responsibility. "Yes." "And David became involved?" David nodded. "Thomas asked him for help." Margaret almost laughed. "Of course he did." There was bitterness in her voice. "Thomas made the mess, and David cleaned it up." David didn't argue. That was how it had always been. Margaret thought about the years she had known Thomas. She remembered him arriving late to family gatherings. David making excuses for him. David lending him money. David taking calls that seemed to leave him exhausted. She had always thought it was ordinary sibling loyalty. Maybe it had been more complicated. What happened to Thomas? David's eyes lowered. He caused an accident. Margaret's stomach tightened. The accident Linda mentioned? Yes. What kind? David hesitated. Thomas was driving home late one night. Margaret waited. He had been drinking. The room seemed to become colder. He hit another vehicle. Margaret covered her mouth. Was anyone killed? David nodded slowly. A young man. Margaret closed her eyes. She could hear the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. For 32 years, she had lived beside a man who had carried the knowledge of a death that had never been spoken about. But there was something else. Margaret opened her eyes. What did Sarah have to do with it? David looked at her. She was in the car. Margaret froze. Sarah? She was 5. Margaret's heart broke. She survived? Yes. Was Linda there? No. Margaret looked down. She couldn't imagine a 5-year-old child being caught in something like that. What happened to Thomas? David's face hardened. He survived. Margaret waited. Then why did you hide all of this? David looked at her. Because Thomas was arrested. Margaret's breath caught. What happened after that? His lawyer said there was a possibility of avoiding prison. Margaret stared at him. How? David hesitated. I don't know. That isn't an answer. David's eyes filled with tears. He wanted to leave. Who? Thomas. Margaret shook her head. So he ran? Yes. And you helped him? David looked down. I helped him get somewhere safe. Margaret stood abruptly. You helped him escape? David's voice broke. I didn't know what else to do. Margaret stared at him. The room seemed to spin. You lied to her. I know. You helped your brother leave after he caused a man's death. I didn't know what would happen. You knew enough. David didn't respond. Margaret walked toward the window. She needed distance from him. She needed air. After a moment, she turned around. What about Linda? David wiped his eyes. She was left alone with Sarah. And you helped her? Yes. Financially? Yes. That's why you kept the photographs? David nodded. She didn't have anyone else. Margaret's anger began to change. It didn't disappear. But it became tangled with something else. Pain. She remembered the newspaper article. The struggling family. The local businessmen. The assistants. Now it made sense. David had helped Linda because he felt responsible for what Thomas had done. But Margaret still couldn't understand why he had hidden it from her. You could have told her. David looked at her. You wouldn't have married her. Margaret froze. David continued. You would have known that my brother had caused a man's death. You would have known that I helped him disappear. You would have known that I spent years sending money to Linda and Sarah. He swallowed. I was afraid you'd see me as guilty too. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. And instead, you let her believe you were just a man with nothing to hide. David nodded. I was wrong. Margaret turned away. She thought about the woman in the photograph. For days, she had feared that Linda had been David's lover. She had imagined betrayal. An affair. A second relationship. A secret child. But the truth was different. It was still terrible. Just not in the way she expected. She turned back toward him. Did you love Linda? David looked genuinely shocked. No. Did she love you? No. Then why did the photograph look like that? David's face changed. What do you mean? You weren't smiling. He looked at the photograph Margaret had placed on the table. I was trying to convince her to take the money. Why? Because she didn't want it. Margaret frowned. Why wouldn't she? Because she believed accepting money from me meant accepting that Thomas could walk away from what he had done. Margaret slowly sat down. So she refused? Yes. What happened to Sarah? David took a long breath. Sarah stayed with Linda. And Thomas? He disappeared. Margaret looked at him. Where? I don't know. She stared at him. You don't know? No. After all these years? David shook his head. I haven't seen him since. Margaret felt something inside her shift. For weeks, she had imagined a secret relationship. But now she was facing something more complicated. Her husband had not betrayed her romantically. He had betrayed her through silence. He had spent 32 years deciding what she was allowed to know about the man she married. That hurt in a different way. Margaret picked up the photograph. She looked at young David standing beside Linda. Now she understood the expression on his face. He hadn't been looking at Linda with love. He had been looking at a woman whose life had been shattered by his brother. And he had believed it was his responsibility to repair something that could never be repaired. Margaret whispered, "Why keep the photograph for 32 years?" David looked at it. "Because it was the last time I saw Sarah before she left town." Margaret looked up. "You said she stayed with Linda." "She did." "Then why did they leave?" David didn't answer. Margaret waited. Finally, he said, "Because there was another part of the story." Her heart sank. What part? David's eyes filled with tears again. I promised myself I would never tell anyone. David. He looked at her. The accident wasn't the only reason Thomas disappeared. Margaret stared at him. What else happened? David opened his mouth. Then stopped. He looked toward the old photograph again. The woman in that photograph wasn't the person I was protecting. Margaret felt a chill move through her. Then who were you protecting? David said nothing. Margaret waited. And for the first time, she realized the photograph had never been the real secret. It had only been the door. The real secret was still waiting behind it. Margaret stared at David. The house had never felt so quiet. For a moment, neither of them moved. The old photograph lay between them on the coffee table. David's younger face looked back at them from a different lifetime. Margaret finally spoke. Who were you protecting? David looked at the photograph. Sarah. Margaret's breath caught. You already told her Sarah was Thomas's daughter. She is. Then what was there left to protect? David's hands tightened together. The truth about what Sarah saw that night. Margaret sat completely still. What did she see? David closed his eyes. For several seconds, he seemed unable to speak. Then he said quietly, she saw Thomas after the accident. Margaret frowned. She was in the car. Yes. She saw her father? Yes. Then why was that a secret? Because she didn't just see him. David's voice became quieter. She saw what happened afterward. Margaret felt a chill move through her. What happened afterward? David looked at her. Thomas wasn't alone. Margaret waited. There was another person in the car. Who? David swallowed. Sarah's mother. Margaret's eyes widened. Linda? No. The answer came so quickly that Margaret almost missed it. No, David repeated. Linda wasn't there. Margaret stared at him. Then who? David looked toward the photograph. The man who died in the accident had been following Thomas. Margaret's confusion deepened. Why? Because of Linda. David explained slowly. Before the accident, Linda had been trying to leave Thomas. Thomas had become increasingly unstable after she refused to continue their relationship. He had threatened her. He had threatened to take Sarah away. The young man who died that night had been Linda's friend. He had agreed to help her move away from Thomas. Thomas discovered what they were planning. He followed them. The confrontation happened on a dark country road. Thomas lost control of the car. The other vehicle was struck. The young man died. Sarah survived. Margaret listened without interrupting. What did David do? David's eyes filled with tears. He arrived after the accident. Margaret frowned. You weren't there when it happened? No. Then how did you know? Thomas called him. Margaret closed her eyes. That explained the old receipt. The hidden photograph. The years of silence. But there was still something missing. Why did Thomas disappear? David looked down. Because Sarah remembered something. What? She remembered Thomas leaving the car. Margaret stared at him. Leaving? He wasn't trapped. David's voice trembled. He was able to walk away. Margaret felt sick. And he left Sarah there? David nodded. She was 5 years old. She was crying. She kept calling for him. Margaret covered her mouth. What did Thomas do? He ran. The words seemed to echo through the room. He left his own daughter? Yes. Margaret thought about the little girl in the photograph. The red sweater. The small smile. She suddenly understood why David had looked so worried beside Linda. He had been looking at a child whose father had abandoned her at the worst moment of her life. What did David do? He found Sarah. Margaret looked at him. You found her? Yes. What happened? David's eyes became distant. I stayed with her until the ambulance came. Margaret's anger softened for a moment. And after that? I went to Linda. Why? Because she needed to know Sarah was alive. Margaret nodded slowly. And Thomas? He called again. What did he say? He said he couldn't go to prison. Margaret's jaw tightened. So you helped him? David nodded. I drove him to a bus station. You helped him leave? Yes. Why? David looked directly at her. Because he was my brother. Margaret felt tears gather in her eyes. That isn't an answer. No, David said quietly. It isn't. He looked down at his hands. I was 29. I was scared. Our parents were falling apart. Thomas said that if he went to prison, everything would be destroyed. Margaret shook her head. Everything was already destroyed. I know. You let him run. Yes. And then you stayed behind and helped Linda and Sarah? Yes. Margaret looked at the photograph again. But why didn't you tell her? David's face crumpled. Because Sarah believed her father had left her. Margaret frowned. He did. Yes. But she was 5. David took a breath. She didn't understand what happened. Linda decided that Sarah needed a chance to grow up without being haunted by the accident. Margaret stared at him. So you kept the truth from her? Yes. For decades? Yes. Even after she became an adult? David nodded. Linda eventually told her that Thomas had abandoned the family. But she never told her that he had been responsible for the accident. Margaret looked toward the window. That was the part she hadn't expected. The secret hadn't simply been about protecting Thomas. It had been about protecting Sarah from the truth about her father. But Thomas came back, Margaret said. David looked surprised. How did she know? Margaret's heart stopped. You said Thomas died 6 years ago. Yes. You knew where he was. David hesitated. Margaret's voice became firm. You said you didn't know where he went. David looked down. I lied. Margaret stared at him. The betrayal came rushing back. You knew? Yes. When? About 10 years after the accident. Margaret waited. Thomas contacted David from Arizona. Did you see him? Once. When? After our 20th anniversary. Margaret felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her. That was 12 years ago. Yes. You saw him and never told her? No. Why? Because he was dying. Margaret went silent. David continued. He had cancer. He had spent years living alone under another name. He had never married. He had no relationship with Sarah. Margaret felt tears roll down her cheeks. What did he want? He wanted to see Sarah. Did he? No. Why? Because Linda refused. Margaret understood. She wanted to protect Sarah. David nodded. And you agreed? Yes. Margaret looked at the photograph. The little girl had become a woman decades ago. A woman named Sarah Parker. A woman who had grown up believing her father simply walked away. She had never known why. She had never known that the father who abandoned her had caused a man's death. And she had never known that David had been the person who stayed. Margaret finally understood the old photograph. It wasn't a photograph of an affair. It wasn't proof of another family. It was a photograph of the moment David had tried to convince Linda that he would take responsibility for a tragedy that wasn't his to fix. Margaret looked at him. Did you love her? David shook his head. No. Did you love Sarah? David's eyes filled. Yes. Margaret nodded slowly. Like a daughter? Like someone who needed someone. That answer broke something inside her. For 32 years, Margaret had feared that David had given another woman the love that belonged to her. Now she realized the truth was more complicated. He had given years of his life to protecting a child from a truth he believed would destroy her. But he had also made a decision for Margaret. He had decided she didn't deserve to know. That was the part she couldn't forgive yet. You should have told her, Margaret whispered. I know. Even if she left. I know. Even if she hated you. David nodded. I know. Margaret wiped her tears. Then why tell her now? David looked at her. Because you found the photograph. Margaret stared at him. No. David's expression changed. She continued. You're telling her now because she finally discovered the truth herself. He lowered his head. Margaret stood. She walked to the window and looked outside. The leaves had begun to fall. For 32 years, she had believed that honesty was the foundation of their marriage. Now she understood that David had loved her while still keeping a locked room inside himself. And she had spent 3 decades living beside a door she never knew existed. Margaret turned back toward him. Does Sarah know? David shook his head. No. Then she deserves to know. He looked frightened. Margaret, she is no longer 5, David said nothing. She deserves to know who her father was. Margaret's voice softened. And she deserves to know who stayed. David looked at her through tears. For the first time since this had begun, Margaret felt certain about one thing. The secret had never belonged to David alone. It belonged to Sarah too. And after 32 years, the truth was finally ready to belong to her. The truth did not make Margaret feel better. It simply made the confusion more precise. For weeks, she had been afraid that David had betrayed her through another woman. Now she knew he had not. There had been no affair. No secret romance. No second family. No hidden child. But there had been something else. A decision. David had spent 32 years deciding what Margaret could handle, what she deserved to know, and which parts of his past should remain locked away. That knowledge hurt in a way she hadn't expected. The next morning, Margaret woke before David. She walked downstairs and made coffee. The house was quiet. For years, mornings like this had felt peaceful. Now the silence felt different. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wedding photograph hanging on the opposite wall. She studied David's younger face. He looked happy. She wondered whether he had been thinking about Thomas that day. Whether he had thought about Linda. Whether he had wondered if Margaret would still marry him if she knew everything. She would never know. At least not completely. David came downstairs around 7. He stopped when he saw her. Did you sleep? A little. He poured coffee. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Margaret said, You need to tell Emily and Daniel. David looked at her. I will. Not everything at once. But enough. David nodded. They're adults. They've always deserved the truth. He sat across from her. I know. Margaret looked at him. I don't know what happens to us now. David's eyes lowered. I understand. I don't know if she can forgive you. I understand. And she doesn't know whether she can forgive herself for not seeing it. David looked up. None of this is your fault. Margaret felt tears in her eyes. Maybe not. But she spent 32 years believing she knew her husband. David swallowed. You did know me. No. Her voice was quiet. But she didn't know all of you. David didn't argue. That was perhaps the hardest part. He simply nodded. I should have told you. Margaret looked away. Yes. The conversation ended there. Not because the pain had disappeared. Because there was nothing else to say. That afternoon, Emily came over. Margaret had asked her to come alone. When Emily walked into the kitchen, she immediately noticed something was wrong. Mom? Margaret looked at her daughter. There were some conversations a mother never wanted to have with her child. This was one of them. There's something about Dad's past that you need to know. Emily sat down. David joined them a few minutes later. For the next hour, they told her the truth. Not every detail. Not the most painful ones. But enough. Thomas. Linda. Sarah. The accident. The death. Thomas running. David helping him leave. The years of financial support. The hidden photographs. The secret that had survived 3 decades. Emily listened without interrupting. When they finished, she stared at her father. You helped him leave? David nodded. Yes. You knew he caused the accident? Yes. And you never told Mom? No. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Why? David looked down. Because I thought I was protecting everyone. Emily shook her head. You weren't protecting everyone. David said nothing. You were deciding for everyone. The words struck Margaret because they expressed exactly what she had been feeling. Emily stood. I need some time. She walked toward the door. Then she stopped. Mom? Margaret looked at her. You okay? Margaret nodded. I will be. Emily left. David remained seated at the table. He looked devastated. Margaret wanted to comfort him. That instinct was still there. 32 years of marriage didn't disappear because of one terrible truth. But she didn't move. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the pain without immediately trying to make it easier for him. The following week, Daniel came home from Chicago. His reaction was different from Emily's. He listened carefully. He asked questions. He wanted to understand why David had made each decision. But when he finally looked at his father, his voice was quiet. You should have trusted Mom. David nodded. I know. Daniel looked toward Margaret. Are you leaving him? Margaret took a breath. I don't know. Daniel nodded. He didn't push her. That meant more to Margaret than he probably realized. The next morning, Margaret called Linda. I think Sarah should know. There was a long silence. Linda finally said, she may hate all of us. She has a right to. She may hate her father. She has a right to that too. Linda sighed. She spent years believing he abandoned her. Margaret looked out the window. He did. Yes. But she deserves to know why. Linda didn't answer immediately. Then she said, she deserves the truth. They agreed to meet 2 weeks later. Sarah arrived alone. Margaret had never met her as an adult. She recognized her immediately. She was 38 now. She had Linda's eyes. The same serious expression. The same quiet way of observing people before speaking. Sarah sat across from Margaret and David. For several minutes, nobody said anything. Then David looked at her. Sarah. She stared at him. I remember you. David's eyes filled with tears. I know. I was 5. Yes. You were there. Yes. You stayed. David nodded. Sarah's eyes became wet. Why did you let me believe my father just left? David struggled to answer. Because I was afraid the truth would destroy you. Sarah looked at him. It was already destroyed. David lowered his head. I know. Sarah looked at Margaret. Did you know? Margaret shook her head. Not until recently. Sarah studied her. Then she asked, how long have you been married? 32 years. Sarah looked down. That is a long time. It is. And he never told you? No. Sarah looked at David again. You kept this secret from both of us. David's eyes filled with tears. Yes. Sarah stood. For a moment, Margaret thought she would leave. Instead, Sarah walked to the window. She stared outside. Then she turned around. I don't know what to do with this. Margaret understood. Neither did she. Sarah left without forgiving David. She left without embracing him. She left without giving anyone the comfort of a perfect ending. And Margaret realized that was exactly how it should be. Some wounds did not close simply because the truth had finally been spoken. 3 days later, David moved into a small furnished apartment. Margaret had asked him to leave temporarily. Not because she had decided to end their marriage. Because she needed to hear her own thoughts without hearing his footsteps in the hallway. The first night alone, Margaret cried. Not because she had stopped loving David. Because she still loved him. That was the hardest part. She loved the man who had stayed beside her through childbirth, illness, financial struggles, family losses, and ordinary mornings. She also resented the man who had hidden something enormous from her. Both feelings were true. Neither canceled the other. Weeks passed. Margaret returned to the library. She spent more time with Emily and the grandchildren. She began walking every morning. Slowly, the house became hers again. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was David's. Margaret opened it. He didn't ask her to take him back. He didn't defend himself. He didn't say he had done everything out of love. He simply told her the truth. Every detail he had left out. Every decision. Every mistake. Every regret. At the end, there was one sentence that stayed with Margaret. David wrote that he had spent 32 years believing silence was a way of protecting the people he loved. Only after losing their trust did he understand that silence had protected him too. Margaret folded the letter. She placed it beside the old photograph. For the first time, the photograph no longer frightened her. It simply reminded her of a truth she had learned much too late. A secret could survive for 30 years. But it could never remain without consequences. And now Margaret had to decide what she wanted the rest of her life to look like. Part 10, A New Life. 6 months later, Margaret no longer measured her days by what David was doing. That was the first change she noticed. At the beginning, every morning had started with a question. Was David going to call? Would he come home? Would he apologize again? Would she forgive him? Would their marriage survive? Those questions had once filled every quiet moment. But slowly, they became less important. Margaret began building her days around something else. Herself. She started walking every morning before breakfast. She returned to the library where she had worked part-time years earlier, volunteering 2 afternoons a week. She joined a small gardening group at the community center. She spent more time with Emily and Daniel and their families. And on Sunday afternoons, she began sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunlight move across the yard. The house was still the same. The kitchen cabinets were still the same. The old clock still ticked above the doorway. The family photographs still covered the shelves. But Margaret felt different inside them. She no longer felt like a woman waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. One Saturday morning, Emily arrived with her 2 children. The grandchildren ran through the house, laughing. Margaret stood in the kitchen preparing sandwiches while Emily watched from the doorway. "You seem happier," Emily said. Margaret smiled. "I think she is." Emily smiled back. "Dad called yesterday." Margaret paused. "How is he?" "He sounds better." Margaret nodded. David had continued living in the apartment. They spoke occasionally. At first, their conversations had lasted only a few minutes. Then, gradually, they became longer. They talked about the children, the grandchildren, the garden, the weather. Sometimes they talked about the past. Sometimes they didn't. Margaret had learned that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It didn't mean pretending that 32 years of silence hadn't happened. And it certainly didn't mean returning immediately to the life they had before. Forgiveness, she was beginning to understand, could simply mean refusing to let someone else's mistake control the rest of her life. There were still difficult days. Some mornings, Margaret would wake up angry. She would remember the drawer, the photograph, the lies, the years of silence, and the anger would return. But then she would remember something else. David had made terrible choices. He had protected the wrong person. He had carried guilt for too long. But he had also spent years helping Linda and Sarah when nobody else would. The truth didn't make him innocent. It simply made him human. And Margaret was learning that human beings could be both loving and deeply flawed. One afternoon, Sarah came to visit. Margaret hadn't seen her since the family meeting. Sarah brought a small box with her. She placed it on the kitchen table. "What is that?" Margaret asked. Sarah smiled faintly. "Something that belongs to you." Margaret opened the box. Inside was an old photograph. The same photograph. The one Margaret had found in David's drawer. But this copy looked older. More worn. On the back, there was writing. Margaret turned it over. There was a date. June 14, 1994. And beneath it were 4 words. He stayed when Dad left. Margaret looked up. Sarah's eyes were wet. Linda found it in an old album. Margaret touched the photograph carefully. She wanted you to have it. Sarah nodded. I hated David when I first learned everything. Margaret remained silent. I thought he had lied to me my whole life. He did keep the truth from you. Yes. Sarah looked down. But then I started thinking about that night. Margaret waited. I was 5. I don't remember everything. But I remember someone holding my hand. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That was David. Sarah nodded. He stayed. The 2 women sat quietly. After a moment, Sarah said, she doesn't think he was a hero. Margaret looked at her. Who? David. Sarah gave a small smile. He made mistakes. Big ones. Margaret nodded. But Sarah thinks he spent 30 years trying to make up for one. Margaret looked at the photograph again. She finally understood why the image had mattered so much to David. It hadn't been a reminder of another woman. It had been a reminder of the moment his brother's choices changed several lives. And perhaps it had also been a reminder that he had failed in one important way. He had never found the courage to tell the truth. Sarah stood. Before leaving, she hugged Margaret. It was unexpected. Margaret held her tightly. For the first time, she didn't think of Sarah as the mysterious woman from the photograph. She thought of her as family. Not because of blood. Because of everything they now understood. That evening, Margaret sat alone on the porch. The sky was turning gold. She held the photograph in her hands. For months, she had wondered whether she should stay with David. She had asked herself whether a marriage could survive a secret that had lasted 32 years. Now she knew the answer wasn't simple. A marriage wasn't saved by pretending the past didn't matter. It was saved, if it could be saved at all, by telling the truth about the past and deciding what to do with it. Margaret didn't know exactly what the future would look like. But she knew one thing. She was no longer afraid of it. A week later, David came to the house. He stood at the front door holding a small paper bag. Margaret let him in. "What is that?" she asked. "Your favorite cinnamon rolls." Margaret smiled. "You still remember?" "I remember everything about you." She looked at him. "Maybe not everything." David nodded. "That's fair." They sat at the kitchen table. For a while, they simply drank coffee. There was no dramatic promise. No sudden declaration. No perfect ending. Eventually, Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his. David looked at her. "I don't know if things can ever be exactly the way they were," she said. "I don't want them to be." Margaret studied his face. "Why?" "Because the way they were allowed me to keep secrets." He took a breath. "If there is another chapter, I want it to be honest." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. She didn't know whether she was ready to move back into the house with him. Maybe she wasn't. But she knew she wasn't ready to close the door forever either. So they agreed to start slowly. Dinner together once a week. Long conversations. No secrets. No pretending. No deciding for each other what the other person could handle. It wasn't a return to their old marriage. It was the beginning of something new. Several weeks later, Margaret stood in front of the bedroom closet. The old drawer was still there. She opened it. It was empty. For years, she had imagined that drawer as the place where David had hidden the truth. Now she saw it differently. The drawer had never been the source of the secret. It had only been where the secret finally came to light. Margaret closed it. Then she walked downstairs. On the kitchen table sat the photograph of David, Linda, and little Sarah. Margaret looked at it one last time. The woman in the photograph had once seemed like a threat. Now she represented something else. A reminder that people could carry pain for decades. That families could survive terrible mistakes. That love could exist alongside betrayal. And that forgiveness did not mean giving someone permission to hurt again. Sometimes forgiveness meant accepting the truth, learning from it, and choosing peace. Margaret picked up the photograph and placed it in a new album. Not hidden in a drawer. Not locked away. Just another part of the story. Her story. Their story. A story that had almost ended because of a secret. But somehow, it had also given Margaret something she hadn't expected. A chance to begin again. Not as the woman she had been before, but as a woman who finally understood her own worth. She stepped outside. The evening air was warm. Across the yard, the grandchildren were laughing. Emily was calling them back inside. Margaret smiled. For the first time in months, the future didn't feel like something she had to fear. It felt like something she could choose. And perhaps that was what healing really meant. Not forgetting what had happened. Not pretending that pain had never existed. But reaching a place where the past could remain behind without deciding where the future would go. Margaret looked toward the fading sunset and took a slow breath. Then she walked back into the house. And this time, she wasn't walking into the life she had lost. She was walking into the life she had chosen. If you were in Margaret's position, would you have given David another chance, or would you have walked away for good? Share your thoughts in the comments.